Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back here to today's edition of Intuitive Angling, and much appreciated you guys making some time out of your day to hang out with me a little bit and check the video out. Really appreciate that. Got a information-packed video for y'all today, guys. We're gonna be talking about the best pound test of line you need to use for flipping and pitching, because it's not just all one thing fits the same size. There's a lot of different considerations to this. Pitching and flipping is probably my favorite way to catch bass in. I've got a lot of experience with it. So we're going to go over what I consider are the best pound test line to use for flipping and pitching based upon what you're pitching and flipping with and the scenarios and the conditions that you're faced with. This will be a good little video here. Also, guys, quick invitation out there. Just like to invite everybody, if you haven't had a chance, to please consider subscribing here to Intuitive Angling. If you subscribe and hit that notification button, you'll never miss any videos. It's free and easy. All you have to do is hit that subscribe button. And also, please check out our fall Fish the Moment lake map breakdowns that I built for Fish the Moment. These are great resources to help you guys out on any lake across the country you're struggling with. So I'll put my lake map breakdown link in the description of the video. Really appreciate that. Okay guys, right off the bat, I'm going to tell you that I flip with 3 different pound test lines probably 95% of the time. And that is 25 pound test, Seaguar and Vizex. All I use is Seaguar and Vizex, guys. And also I'll link the Seaguar and Vizex link in my tackle warehouse description. Guys, I've tried everything. This is the best line to flip and pitch with by far. So I'll link everything in the description there. But 25 pound test, 20 pound test, and 17 pound test. Now, that may not seem like a big difference. There's some minimal diameter difference in the line, but there's a lot of other things to consider with that. So I sort of want to go over when I use these 3 different line pound tests under what conditions. Now, let me talk a little bit about the 5% that I do not use the fluorocarbon and Vizex here. The only other 5% I use is braided line. And I will use 50 pound test Seaguar Smackdown braid if I'm flipping like heavy mats, like in hyacinth mats and matted grass, like in Florida or something, or super thick reeds, very, very thick cattails. But it has to be some cover that is so dense and so thick that I can't afford to have any line stretch whatsoever. And it's a pure flipping deal. It's like when I'm flipping straight into that super heavy cover, that's the only time that I'm using the braided line. And to be honest with you guys, about the only time that I flip with braid is if I'm in Florida fishing. Anywhere else in the country, Seaguar and Vizex fluorocarbon is my #1 choice. Another thing with that, guys, is a lot of people, I think a big mistake that a lot of people do that get into pitching and flipping, and even some guys that are fairly decent at it, is they rely too much on braided line. You do not want to use braided line for flipping and pitching unless you absolutely have to, in terms of the power to get that fish away from there, because you will sacrifice bites for braid. Braid, even the low visibility lines like the Seaguar Smackdown, any type of braided line is simply more invisible than fluorocarbon. Fluorocarbon line is like invisible in the water. And so in terms of actually generating a bite, you're going to sacrifice bites for sure by using braided line. So there's a balance there. There's a give and take as far as in terms of losing the amount of bites and getting the fish in when they finally do bite. I'll give you guys one prime example when I did use braided line pretty effectively in fishing. I was fishing a FLW tournament down at Sam Rayburn, Texas, and the water was flooded really high. And they have these bushes down there in Sam Rayburn they got thorns all over them, and they're super, super thick. I mean, gnarly, thorny type trees, and they were in like 8 and 10 foot of water. And I couldn't get the fish out with fluorocarbon simply because of the stretch, and it was hard to get them out with braided line. I had to use braided line, or I was gonna, if I got 10 bites on fluorocarbon in this cover, I'd probably get 3 or 4 of them in. And with the braid, I got like maybe 7 out of 10 in. It was even so thick for braid, so that's the only time. For most guys, even if you do flip mats, for most of the time you can get away with straight fluorocarbon. So let's talk about the pound test here, different situations. I want to start with the 25 pound test on work down. The 25 pound test line, guys, is I use most all the time for my thicker flipping and pitching applications, or if I'm pitching and flipping a jig. If I'm pitching and flipping like my Blaukat old school jig here, I flip and pitch it on 25 pound test most all of the time, unless I'm fishing water depths that are like greater than 4 or 5 feet. Now, one of the reasons that I do like the heavier line on a jig is not only that a larger diameter line, you know, you're apt to less break-offs. And by the way, I've used Seaguar and Vizex guys for a decade. I have never broke it one single time pitching and flipping the 25-pound test. But the 25-pound test makes the bait fall a little bit slower. And that's another thing to consider when you're pitching and flipping. As you get to heavier line sizes, the larger diameter size of the line is going to make the descent rate of your lures a little bit slower, simply because it's, you know, a larger diameter to cut through the water. So that's another factor to take into consideration, is the larger diameter line is going to make your bait fall a little bit slower, and it's also going to make it fall a little bit more on a horizontal plane. So that's a big factor with that. And that can be positive. That's not anything negative. That can be positive. But if I'm flipping a full-size jig like my throwback jig here, I'm usually pitching and flipping it on 25-pound test, even if I'm pitching and flipping it to sparse cover. Like if I'm flipping it to the edge of a stump or on a bluff bank, I always use the 25-pound test on the bigger bait. And same as if I'm using like a bigger creature bait, like a Zoom brush hog. A lot of times I'll use, you know, the heavy line on that too, depending upon the sinker that I use. Now, another factor in determining if I use 25-pound test or lighter, if I'm Texas rigging a bait, has to do with the weight of the sinker. If I'm pitching and flipping a heavy sinker or heavier sinker, like anything anything over like a half-ounce sinker, that's when I go to the 25-pound test most all of the time with that. Or if I'm flipping and pitching into some type of a situation where my line is over something, like if I'm flipping into a flooded bush, or if I'm flipping into like a lay down tree where my bait is over a limb, I want that extra strength of the 25-pound test. And I will drop down in pound test down to 20 or 17 based upon a combination of a couple factors here. Now, let's say, for example, if I'm pitching and flipping into you know, a lay down tree or a log or something like that. If I'm using a fairly heavy weight, like anything half-ounce or bigger on my jigs or my, you know, Texas rigs, even if that cover's sparse, I got 25 on. If I have to downsize my weight as far as like go to a lighter jig, like if I go to a 3/8 ounce jig, or if I go to a lighter slip sinker, like something like a, you know, a 5/16, 3/8, something like that, then unless the cover is super thick, I may downsize to the 20-pound test, simply because you just have a little bit better feel on it. And I don't want that bait to slow down that much, because if I go to a lighter sinker and I stay with the 25-pound test line, sometimes the bait will fall too slow. And depending upon things like current or wind, I may not want the bait to you know, fall slow. I may want it to fall a little bit faster. And then finally, the 17-pound test is for situations where my bait is downsized. Like instead of having a bigger creature bait like a brush hog or a Z-hog or a beaver or a full-size jig, let's say I'm pitching and flipping something like a 7-inch plastic worm, you know, a smaller bait, or like a Cinco. Say I'm flipping and pitching a Texas rig Cinco, or maybe some type of a smaller finesse jig. When I go to the 17-pound test, it's usually because I've downsized my lure, and I never go to 17-pound test on those bigger sizes, with the exception is if I'm pitching and flipping into, you know, deeper, cleaner water. So some situations out there, I've had some clear water situations where I'm pitching and flipping a bait onto some type of sparse cover, like next to bridge piers or next to boat dock pilings where the water visibility is pretty clear. Say if I'm fishing a boat dock piling and the water visibility is 4 feet, a lot of times if I'm pitching like a jigs or something into those boat dock pilings and the water's clear, I will also downsize my line, not necessarily because it's more invisible. That's not my factor. It's the fact that that bait gets down farther. In clear water, if the predominant cover that I'm fishing is in deeper water, I'm not concerned about how fast that bait fishes falls. I want that bait to fall fast and get on the bottom, because that's where that fish is going to be. Now, the fall rate, when you're considering larger diameter lines as a fall rate in pitching and flipping, there's a couple different considerations there. A lot of it has to do with your water temperature in correlation with your water clarity. You're going to find, for the most part, the dirtier the water and the cooler the water, that is when you want those slower falls. So in those situations, that is when I use the heavier line a lot. Let's say, for example, I've downsized my jig size to like, I went to, a lighter 3/8 ounce throwback jig, and I've got a little bit off colored water. Say the water visibility is 1.5 feet or, 12 inches, 1.5 feet, and I've got cover in shallow water. Let's say I got 12 inches of visibility, the water's 2.5 or 3 feet deep, and I've got a nice lay down log coming into the water, and the water temperature is in the 50s. In that dirtier, cooler water, I want that slower fall. So then I'll go to a lighter bait, lighter head on there with the heavier line. So it all depends on the combination of those factors. And also, just like I said before, you got to consider the wind and the current. If you're out there on a day where the wind's blowing 20 miles an hour, or you're like fishing some of the Alabama River, Coosa River fisheries where you got significant current, then you need heavier lures, and therefore you can get away with heavier line on there. But the main thing, guys, is when you're pitching and flipping, don't get scared about the size of the line in terms of fish seeing it. The two mistakes that I see anglers make a lot pitching and flipping, like I said, is number one is they use braided line too much, and they pitch and flip with too light a line. A lot of guys that I take out on my lessons and co-anglers I see, they flip with like 17-pound test line as a maximum pound test, even on those big baits I'm talking about, even in heavy cover. One of the things that I learned early on from my mentor, Terry Thomas, that taught me how to pitch and flip is do not be afraid of heavy line. And Terry got me started flipping 30-pound test mono, which is a lot larger diameter than 25-pound test Seaguar and Vizix fluorocarbon. So go heavy. I mean, if you're pitching and flipping, guys, it's not going to hurt you most of the time. Very seldom is it going to hurt you going too heavy with your line. The only time it could possibly hurt you is with your efficiency on flipping and pitching that heavier line in windy, current laden waters with lighter jigs and lighter sinkers. Other than that, I use 25-pound test most all the time, and most all the great flippers I did, did the same thing. Tommy Biffle, Denny Brower, Gary Klein, all the really great flippers in the history of flipping, they all use 25 and 30-pound tests. That's how I grew up using it too. So if I could give you one piece of advice, guys, get you a spool of 25-pound test Seaguar and Vizix, and it's going to take care of most of your flipping and pitching needs. Like I said, I'll link it all in the description of the video, and that's sort of a overview. Now there's a lot of other considerations here too, guys, because another thing with that is you've got a lot of different lure categories out there. I flip everything from a little tube to a little 4-inch ringworm to something like the Megabass sleeper craw. I flip a ton of different type of baits, and all of those baits, based upon the conditions and the size and the weight and all the water clarity and temperature and all that, it requires you mixing that line up. So you need 17, you need 20, you need 25-pound tests. Those are the three lines that you use, and it'll get 95% of your flipping and pitching done. But main thing, if I can give you one piece of advice from this video here, is reduce the amount of time you use braided line. The only time that you really ever need to use braided line, guys, is, like I said, flipping mats in Florida, or if you're in just some freakishly heavy cover. But if you're flipping and pitching traditional targets like trees, lay down trees, stumps, boat docks, flooded bushes, sparse grass beds, lily pads, all the traditional bass fishing cover, you can get by with fluorocarbon in those 3-pound tests that I talked about. So hope it helps out. We'll talk later.